Kadir.
And I'm Peter Johns.
And we are chiropractic students studying at ACC here in Adelaide. We prepared this video that we're going to place on YouTube to help educate the general public about stress, coping mechanisms, and social support. Peter and I will explain how these factors work and highlight how it can help you manage stressful situations in your life. We will give you short examples of stress and how you can easily relate to it and understand how successful adaptations can help you manage that stress. We hope you learn a thing or two from our presentation, and if you find that information, please provide a comment below. Also, to let you know, we will provide our references down below in the comment section. So let's give this a go. So Peter, what is stress?
Okay, so stress. Stress can be any stressful situation. It can be internal or external to the body. An example of external stress could just be a noisy environment, where internal stress is something that you experience. It's something like worrying about losing your job. Internal or external stresses can both trigger hormones that influence the body to have a physiological response. For example, a stressful incident can do things like make your heart pound harder, it can make you breathe faster, it can make your muscles tense up, it could also make you sweat. Stress is a biological mechanism in the body that triggers the flight or flight response. It does this to overcome the stressor, or it will help you run away from the stressor. And usually, once the reaction has passed, the body relaxes. However, if the stressful event is prolonged and the body continues without relaxation, then this is classified as chronic stress.
Right, so Peter, am I getting this right? Is stress always a negative thing?
Stress can be either negative or positive.
Right.
Notably, the body itself cannot physically distinguish between positive and negative stresses. The difference is dependent on the experience of the individual experiencing the stress. Negative stress has negative implications and is usually perceived to be potentially overwhelming or out of the person's control. Things like catastrophes, illness, accidents tend to be focused on the negative stress. On the other hand, you have positive stress. Positive stress is emotional or cognitive response to stress that is healthy. It gives us a feeling of fulfillment or happiness. Positive stress correlates with life satisfactions and hopes because it fosters challenge and motivates us towards our goals. So Omar, I'm led to believe that you're here today to talk to us about reducing stress, an interesting topic.
Yeah, well, Pete, it's interesting that you mentioned that with stress, it's definitely something real. It's something that we face in everyday life. We've got to learn how do we acknowledge that, because I think recognizing what we're dealing with is the first step to trying to manage it. So, look, according to those journals that I had a look at, psychologists talks about two ways of coping, and coping is the term used here when basically an individual trying to deal with the stress that they're facing. So those two coping techniques are either emotional coping or problem-solving type coping. And I'll go through that in a little bit. But basically, what we'd like to say is here is those coping mechanisms help individuals to effectively cope better with life situations and reduce the level of anxiety or even worse, depressions.
Okay, so how does emotional coping work?
Well, emotional coping is how when you have negative emotions such as embarrassment, fear, anxiety, depression, frustration, all of that stuff, to reduce it, regulate it, or even eliminate it by the individual, that process is referred to as emotional coping. It is only a realistic option, Pete, when the source of the stress is outside the person's control. There's nothing you can do about that. So then emotional coping is helpful. Now, it's also, there's a lot of examples of emotional coping that we do in our daily life. I'll give you some of them, like when people eat too much or too little, and you go like, why do they need to eat so much? Well, that could be an emotional coping, is that they express it through their food habits, or even drink with alcohol or drugs. Even when people drive their car too fast or chew their nails, well, that's another form of, you can say, negative emotional coping.
All right, so emotional coping is all negative?
Not necessarily, Peter. So there is positive emotional coping. So, for example, distraction is classified as positive because you're keeping yourself busy to take your mind off the issue that is frustrating you or creating that anxiety. Emotional disclosure is an interesting one where you actually go down and write down your emotions, and that helps precipitate those emotions. So as you're writing them down, it just helps to take them off your chest, so to speak. Another form is praying for guidance and strength. I guess religious people might use that quite often. And meditation and mindfulness is another form. So there are positive ways of, as you can see, dealing with emotional coping. The important message that I'd like to emphasize here is when we are applying emotional methods, we could be suppressing emotions for an extended period of time, which can compromise our immune competence and lead to poor physical health.
Okay, so we perceive our emotional stress in many ways, which makes sense to me. You said earlier that other ways to perceive stress, other ways to process stress is by problem solving. So how does this work?
Well, problem solving differ from emotional coping. So in problem solving, it's pretty much us identifying the stressors and create strategies to manage them. So it's a powerful tool to add to your skill set, but you gotta acknowledge that it's completely different from emotional. So an example of that is when you got an exam and you're stressing about it, and you don't know where to start, you don't know how much to read, what chapters to include, what type of questions is coming. So if you decided to approach the teacher or write an email to the teacher to discuss that, the feedback that you might receive, it may give you a bit of insight to hone in your study and dealing with that anxiety that you've got a bit better. So in a way, you feel you're a bit more in control after you've received that teacher's feedback.
Okay, so that sounds pretty logical to me. So why can't we only use problem-focused solving then?
Well, I mean, you could have a preference to one technique over the other, but there's no one coping mechanism that will help you deal with all. So, for example, if you're dealing with a loss of a family member, I mean, you can't use problem solving in that. That's when we go back to what we said earlier, is you're dealing with factors that are outside your control. So you'll have to use emotional focused coping in that case to deal with that loss.
So do you think there's a difference between the response between men and women when they're facing stress?
Well, according to the study in 95, they found that there's differences between the responses that receive, between males and females when it comes to expressing emotions in particular. Females had a greater tendency to seek advice and social support. So according to this study, yes, there are differences between us and our female counterparts.
Okay, so we've learned about problem solving and emotional coping.
Yeah.
Now I'd like to talk about our social interactions and how they can affect us. So social interactions are among the most positive and rewarding relationships humans experience, which has been highlighted in a 2010 study. Social support is one aspect of social interactions, and it is linked with many aspects of health, including emotional health, mental health, physical health, and well-being. An example is close relationships. When partners share their life experiences with empathy, love, trust, and care. In a study undertaken in a Chinese university, it highlighted the importance of this. So the paper found that students with poor social support networks were significantly more likely to associate with suicide ideation. The study also found that students with reduced risk of suicide ideation were associated with an increased seeking of guidance and support. The study concluded that social networks affect the person's psychological state. So their social interactions directly influence their self-esteem, their self-confidence, and their openness.
Well, after listening to that, so is it really like social support? Is it all I have to do is basically be selective with the people around me, people that support my ideas basically will improve my mental health and well-being? Is it really that simple?
Well, not exactly, Omar. It turns out humans are a little bit more complicated.
More complicated how?
Well, you know how we said that social support is vital in reducing stress? It turns out that the amount of social support is what is key here.
The amount? What do you mean?
So, social support can be perceived support. This is where the individual believes they have support available from friends, family, and significant others. The research on perceived support has found that when people perceive a high level of social support, they tend to be healthier and better at coping with stress. And this has been backed up by a 2007 study. On the other hand, those who have a high level of received support, in other words, genuine support provided by others, they tend to need more help. They have lower self-esteem, they have trouble coping with stress. As such, perceived social support often has more positive outcomes than coping with stressful situations. Whereas received support can have adverse effects when individuals feel like they cannot help themselves. They feel as if they need to access help from others.
Certainly very interesting, Pete, is that whole element about perceived support versus real support, and just hearing it from you about the amount of support that makes a difference. I mean, it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Between what you provide those people and the whole thing of perceived support. Certainly interesting learning about that, and unfortunately we've got a limited time for this, so I'll try to summarize what our learnings here for everyone's benefit. So stress is really a normal part of everyone's life. We can't live life without stress, unfortunately. They go hand in hand, and it's a way of us evolving and getting better and adapting to life. So the steps to reduce stress is what we'd like to summarize as we've discussed. So firstly, we identify the reason for the stress. Was it an emotional trigger or was it something else? Being able to identify those elements help us to pin down, the type of strategy that we're going to apply.
So secondly, apply a suitable coping mechanism, especially ones that have worked in the past, to reduce anxiety and aim to understand the stress. Like find the root cause of the stress, try and minimize it or even eliminate it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then surround yourself with a social network, ideally of like-minded people who can empower you and give you a gauge for your mental health and well-being from an outsider perspective. People that you can trust and they give you an honest and a good feedback.
And last but not least, if the stress is overwhelming and it's outside of your control's limits, then seek professional help from your GP or your psychologist.